Burnaby North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've been listening to this budget debate with great interest for more than a week now. And I'm so pleased that today I get to take my place in the debate. And I've been fascinated and sometimes perplexed by the way we sometimes talk past each other across the aisle. And in the time allotted to me today, I want to concentrate on the philosophical underpinnings that separate the two approaches to setting economic policy. By the end, I hope that you'll agree with me that while our approach is different from that espoused by the opposition, it is based on sound and tested economic practice and will benefit British Columbia. Let me begin by recalling the words used by the Minister of Finance to introduce Budget 2019. She shared some important childhood memories, memories of a time when, in her words, dinner hour was animated with discussion and a wave out the door as family headed off to a volunteer meeting to support a cause or help out a neighbor. My grandparents and mom never lectured about why we dedicated our time to people. It was just part of our everyday life. Now, the member from Kamloops North, Thompson, called her words a speech about nothing. Now, that wasn't really very nice. Or maybe he just didn't get the point. But after sitting across from them for almost 2 years, I still haven't figured out whether the BC Liberals are being provocative or they really don't understand. So let me spell out what I think the minister was signaling to the people of British Columbia and why I think it's so important. The finance minister was reminding us that there was a time, not so long ago, when average, hard-working families knew that their efforts would be rewarded with a decent standard of living and a secure future. When parents could be confident that their children would be better off than they had ever been themselves. When people felt like contributors to society and not resources to be exploited. When we viewed our neighbours as people with whom we shared a mutual dependency and not as competitors who might take our jobs, devalue our homes, or get an advantage before we did. I remember those times too. In fact, I was already in my 30s before I saw someone sleeping in a doorway. Yet today, homelessness has become so endemic that hundreds of people in cities all across Canada held Coldest Night of the Year walks this past weekend to raise money for the hungry and the homeless. To understand the significance of this budget, it is important to refresh our memories about how we got here. I have a long memory, and I can almost pinpoint the moment in history when the sense of hope and social cohesion that characterized the post-war era took a turn towards despair, rage, and alienation that seems to define the world today. Things started changing right around the time Ronald Reagan became President of the United States and Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of Britain, and neoliberalism was unleashed upon the world. Neoliberalism, the belief that markets are smarter than any human, that the market should be allowed to go wherever it wants in pursuit of cheap labor and abundant raw materials, and nothing should be allowed to stand in its way, not unions, not health and safety, not the environment, not human rights, nothing. And so we entered the age of privatization, international trade agreements, union busting, deregulation, and austerity. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because it exactly describes the program of policies stubbornly pursued by the BC Liberals for the 16 years they were in power, and by their ancestors, the Socreds, who came before them. That's why the BC Liberals sat by and let housing prices spiral out of control right under their noses. Not our job. Let the market decide. That's why they let BC Hydro and ICBC rack up huge debts. The market knows what it's doing. That's why they cut corporate taxes to historic lows and shifted the burden to average British Columbians by doubling tuition, doubling MSP payments, and introducing a wide array of fees. That's why they gutted the Labour Code, privatized long-term health care, and weakened workers' compensation. And that's why they didn't notice that money laundering had become such a lucrative industry. If it was a problem, the market would have let us know. They said they were stimulating the economy, but really, they were just following a formula, and they are still beating the same drum today. Their entire critique of Budget 2019 is couched in dog whistle neoliberalism, and I challenge the very premise of their critique. Neoliberalism is not economics. It is ideology dressed up as economic policy, and it does not work, at least not for the vast majority of the world's population, and that includes the average BC family. It's been more than 40 years since Reagan and Thatcher promised that if we set the corporate sector free, it would make massive profits, and those profits would trickle down to the rest of us. But when? When is this going to happen? 40 years later, the people of the world are still waiting. The hopes and dreams of 3 generations have already been sacrificed like guinea pigs to this experiment. The reality is that those huge profits are not trickling down and never did. That's what French economist Thomas Piketty concluded after completing his groundbreaking research into the way wealth has been accumulated and distributed over the last 250 years. In fact, the gap between rich and poor has grown alarmingly around the world, and nowhere more so than in the United States and Great Britain, the earliest adopters of neoliberalism. Countries that seem to be on the brink of social disintegration. Today, 82% of all the wealth in the world has been concentrated in the hands of the richest 1%. 82%, almost all of the world's wealth. And the people of British Columbia did not escape this trend. By the time the BC Liberals had left office, the richest 3% of British Columbians owned 54% of all the wealth. And even Alan Greenspan, longtime and now former chair of the Federal Reserve of the United States, and arguably one of the architects of trickle-down economics, admitted after the subprime mortgage and credit crisis of 2007, he admitted that he was wrong. And yet, the BC Liberals keep repeating their tired, old, discredited free trade mantra. And so it begs the question, Mr. Speaker, why? Why can't they connect the dots? Why can't they see the connection between the choices they made in government and the unprecedented number of people living precariously and dying of overdoses? Now, if they want to believe that the earth is flat, let them. That's not going to hurt anybody. But forcing neoliberalism on the people of British Columbia, people do get hurt. So again, why? Well, their finance critic gave us a clue last week in her response to the budget. What she said was, there is only one way to grow the economy and create jobs. Only one way, that kind of statement is dangerous and irresponsible. And it's one that you should not make lightly, especially if all you're trying to do is score points and undermine the credibility of your opponent. But need I remind her about what is happening right now in the United States and Britain, where right-wing parties are marching in the streets, Trump supporters are physically attacking reporters, and racists are not even trying to hide their hostility anymore, and where fundamentalism, the belief that there is only one true way, is on the rise. And Canada and British Columbia is not immune to what is happening around the world. We even saw it played out in the Burnaby South by-election, when some particularly ugly slurs were shouted out at all candidates' meetings. And in all my years in Burnaby politics, I have never experienced this before. Legislators need to choose our words carefully and with regard to who may be listening and what absolutist notion they may think it validates. Now, I don't entirely blame the BC Liberals for hanging on to, and even beyond the point of reason, to what is now a discredited and bankrupt ideology. For one thing, neoliberalism is pretty hegemonic. And as the saying goes, what can a fish tell you about water? Think of the generations of economists and national leaders who were trained and advised by Milton Friedman, and before him, Friedrich Hayek and the Mount Pelerin Society, and all the high-powered think tanks created to give credence to neoliberal thought, like the Fraser Institute, just to name the one closest to home. Neoliberalism is everywhere. And speaking of economist Milton Friedman, who wielded immense influence during his lifetime, let's remember that he left his fortune explicitly to be used to destroy the public education system. Today, 70% of Trump's White House staff are part of the neoliberal thought collective, as is his vice president. And to use the BC Liberals' own terminology, we shouldn't be surprised that neoliberal thought is baked in to their politics. Now, before turning to how Budget 19 is actually transformational, how it expands the horizons of what is possible for individuals, for families, and for society, let me talk about how the average citizen has had to adapt to survive under neoliberalism. Well, firstly, people started working longer hours. Overtime wasn't something that you did on occasion, you came to count on it to pay the bills. I remember in the 1980s, when I was a union rep, a lighthouse keeper called me just before Christmas, absolutely distraught. He had always worked overtime on Christmas. And for the first time, his employer was giving him those stat holidays off. He did not know, without that overtime, how he was going to pay for the Christmas presents. That's how much people like him had come to count on overtime. Another way that people survived is they started taking on huge, unprecedented debt loads. And the expectation to be in debt for the rest of your life became common. Now, when I was a university student, I didn't have a credit card. We couldn't, as students, qualify for credit cards. We didn't have any money. But by the time my son went to university, banking regulations had been loosened up, and all the big banks were up on campus flogging their cards to young kids who could all of a sudden live as if they had money. Then think about the arrival of Walmart and McDonald's. And that meant that people could afford to buy lots of stuff and fill up on cheap food. Never mind that our cheap jeans were being made by workers on the other side of the world for $1 a day. I've been there. I've visited those workers in their shanties where they slept on dirt floors. I've dug around in my purse to find aspirin to give to a mother because she couldn't afford to buy it herself to bring down her child's fever. And don't get me started on the contradictory choices that pension fund investors had to make to ensure that the fund would still be there when the time came to retire. But, Mr. Speaker, individualized survival comes with consequences, and the chickens have come home to roost. People have started turning on each other, blaming each other for the narrowing of their prospects. Again, just look at what is happening south of the border. And here at home, even, extremists are getting bold. But it's not too late. The people of British Columbia are breathing a sigh of relief today. And not just because Budget 19 contains concrete measures to put more money back in their pockets, not just because we've eliminated interest on student loans, which means that Jovi, who lives in my community, is planning on going back to school to upgrade her skills, get a better job, so she can make more of a contribution to her family income. And not just because this time next year, MSP premiums will be completely eliminated, returning as much as $1,800 to families to spend on other necessities. And not just because Budget 2019 introduces the new BC Child Opportunity Benefit. Starting in October 2020, families with one child will start receiving up to $1,600 every year until that child reaches the age of 18. Those with two children will receive up to $2,600, and those with 3 or more children will receive up to $3,400 per year. This benefit can make a huge difference in many families. It can mean new warm winter coats, or piano lessons, or more fruits and vegetables on the dinner table, and school lunches, and a bus pass. And it's not just because extended BC families, like grandmothers and aunties who support children and keep them out of care, will have their support payments increased to match those of foster parents. These are just some of the highlights of Budget 2019. All told, it will reduce the tax bill of the average BC family by 43%. But this is not the only reason British Columbians are breathing a sigh of relief. People that I talk to are relieved because this budget signals that the era of doctrinaire austerity is over. They are relieved because finally they have a government that is investing directly in people, a government that knows that the economy is more than just an abstract concept. It is the people who build the economy with their talents and skills, and grow the local economy with the goods and services they purchase in their own communities with their wages. BC 2019 commits an enormous capital investment in schools, roads, hospitals, and other infrastructure. These projects will provide good-paying jobs to thousands of British Columbians with money to spend. These projects will also sustain a vast network of local suppliers. This budget is balanced, and I don't mean just that it balances the books. This budget represents a more balanced approach than we've seen in 16 years. It balances the needs of both the business community and the people who work for them and purchase their goods and services. And it's not like we're making this up out of our heads. It's not some theory that was cooked up at a resort in the Swiss Alps. There are living models thriving right now in the real world, where this balanced approach has produced stable economies, political stability, and better living conditions for everyone. Countries like Finland, Sweden, Denmark. Remember how the finance minister introduced the budget by reminding us of happier times. Well, that could be us again. Thank you.